So let's say you've just bought a new bike, or bought a new second-hand bike, or your bike's been sitting in the shed, or you're just going out for a ride. A few basic bike checks to make sure you're safe and make sure your bike's not going to prematurely wear or do any damage that's not necessary. First of all, for safety, above anything else, is definitely your pedals. When you spin backwards, these have the ability to unwind, so if they're not nipped up properly, they'll unwind when you're sitting up the top of the track spinning backwards or talking to your mates, whatever. It happens, and it has happened before. I've seen it happen before. It's happened to me before. Doesn't matter who your mechanic is, doesn't matter the bike shop, how you trust them, whatever. Always check your pedals yourself. So they've got a Allen key bolt in the back of them that you can get to from either underneath or through the frame. Allen key or just a pedal wrench, whatever. Just make sure they're nipped up nice and tight. You don't have to wrench on them, but make sure they're nipped up nice and tight, because if that comes off at a bad time, it could be a lot of bad news for you, big injuries. So pedals, first of all. Second of all is your derailleur. So where your derailleur bolts onto the hanger, these bikes have just got a habit of unwinding that bolt and your derailleur coming loose, and then you're giving you the sense that your gears aren't working properly. Obviously sometimes, all the time, your gear cable will stretch, but a lot of the time that mishap and the playing up with your gears, especially if it's a newer bike, will be your derailleur coming loose and wiggling around on that hanger. So first thing I do is I'll pull it off, put some Loctite on the thread of the derailleur, leave it for a minute or so, let it tack up a little bit, wind it back in, and then I won't ride the bike for a day. Let it really settle in and bond properly. So derailleur sorted, pedals sorted, pretty safe. Headset. So grab the front brake, give the bike a little bit of a wiggle. If that feels tight and there's no play, there's no rock back and forward, you'll feel a little bit of rock from your brake pads sitting through in the caliper, but it's no big deal. You're looking for that it's a very distinct feeling. You're looking for that feeling right where the headset and the frame meet, the top of the frame meet. It'll wiggle, it'll rock. So if that's nice and tight, you're fine. If it's a little bit loose, then you got to undo these two bolts on your stem, undo the bolt at the top just to free it up. Pop that top cap off, make sure it's nice and clean inside there where the spider goes down into your steerer tube. Wind it all back up, and it's a good idea to just take the pressure off of that, off of the front end, so the stem bolts are loose. Take the pressure off the front end and wind that up. It says here 4 Newton meters max. I like to do it till it's snug, till you get no play. So grab the front brake again, give it a little slight wiggle, and you'll feel that it goes from really playful when it's loose to like really slopping around to tighter, and do it up slowly, so you're not pushing things unnecessarily. Everything's going in straight and square, so you're not doing any damage. So wind it on, and then once it's nice and tight, give it a little wiggle, not too much. You want to be gentle with it. Little wiggle, and then once you're happy with that, do up your stem bolts, making sure that you've got your handlebars aligned with your stanchions of your fork. I like to align the handlebars with the stanchions of the fork. So one eye closed, look directly over the center of the bike, and just line them up, and then wind it on. So get them nice and straight, get your bars nice and square. That'll definitely lengthen the amount of life you'll get out of that head tube, or the headset. Important to keep on top of that. A lot of bikes, you get onto them and they're wobbly and whatever. Stay on top of that, and your bike will feel good. It'll be quieter. You won't get much feedback through the front end. When they're loose, it feels horrible at the front. So that's a sign as well. If it's feeling really bad at the front, real knocky, you might have a loose headset. Axles. Make sure your rear axle. So it's got a quick release lever, so it's good. You can always look back and make sure that lever is pointing in the same direction every time you ride. It's a pretty easy check. You just look over your shoulder. Yep, still pointing in the right direction, hasn't unwound itself. Something to keep an eye on, because they do unwind themselves, and if you go too far and it's unwound too far without you checking on it, you can do some damage to the back end. So stay on top of that. have a position that you like it sitting in, or that you know that it's sitting in, make a mental note of it and you should be fine. Same story with the front axle. So it's always right below you, so you can check it all the time with your eyes. Make sure it's nice and snug when you do it up. If it's bolts, check your bolts. If it's quick release, check your quick release. These maxills, you can alter where that lever sits in relation to the rest of the fork. So it's quite an easy process, but just stay on top of it. Make sure they're tight. So next up is the pivot bolts. So we've got this center bolt on this bike has come undone a couple of times. It came undone initially after a couple of rides, and I nipped it up. It came undone again after a couple of rides. Now I've done probably 5 or 6 rides on it since, and it hasn't come undone again, which is really good. So I must be finding a home there, binding in or whatever it does, but it doesn't seem to be a problem now. Upper shock mount, stay on top of that. Give it a few checks. Check it every couple of rides, and then once you've developed some trust in it, then you can leave it. But new bikes especially, they'll quite often come unwound, so stay on top of that. Lower shock mount, depending on the configuration of your suspension, there's obviously going to be more bolts or less bolts, but all of your shock hardware, all of your suspension mounting, check those bolts regularly. Make sure you're on the ball with your torque settings. Get it either relatively close or spot on. If you've got a torque wrench, obviously spot on. If you're just using Allen keys, get to know the torque specifications by hand, by feel. Takes a lot of time, but you can get there. So that's pretty much it for your initial setup. Pivot bolts, axles on your wheels, headset, derailleur. It's also super important to make sure these bolts on your stem are always nipped up. So if you've moved your bars or taken your bars off or sent your suspension away for service, whatever it is, you've got to make sure that you and only you check these bolts. You can't rely on anybody else to make sure your bike's safe. If these bolts are loose and you come through a rough section and those bars twist forward, it's good night. There's probably going to be a crash. It's likely to end up in a crash. I've seen it happen and it's nasty. So that. Now, tightening up your brakes. I like to leave my levers a little loose, so if I have a big crash and they get hit, they'll twist around the bar instead of busting off. With a carbon bar, you obviously got to have them to spec anyway. Aluminium bar, people just wrench them on. I like them loose enough to move in a crash, but not so loose that I can move them by hand. You shouldn't be able to move them by hand, but they should definitely be loose enough to move in a crash. Caliper bolts, do them up nice and tight, make sure they're tight so you don't get any vibration, unnecessary vibration through your brakes. And your grips, these are super important as well. So it's little things, but if you don't keep these grips done up and you get a slip and it's in a race run, it's going to throw you off, and you're going to ride tentative until you can get to the bottom and do them up again. I don't like the idea of running slide-on grips at all on a mountain bike. We do too much pulling and pushing and wrenching the bike around and taking big hits where you're creating force over the bar and under the bar. Lock-on is always the way to go. So make sure your lock-ons are nice and tight. You can't wrench the grip out of place on your bar by hand. Okay, that's a good check. And if that's good, you're good. And then you got your daily checks when you go out for a ride. So I've got a digital tire pressure gauge in my toolbox. So I run 27 psi in the back by the digital gauge and 25 in the front. Seems to work for me. And if it's a super hot day, I'll check my suspension pressure, because usually on a really, really hot day, everything will firm up just a little bit. The PSI seems to rise maybe 5 or 6 PSI, so I'll check that as well on a real hot day. But otherwise, as long as the pivot bolts are good, the pedals are good, and the derailleur's good, I know everything else is good because I've checked it initially. I've checked all these bolts. But like I said, don't trust anyone else to work on your bike. You can take it to the shop and get it worked on and whatever, that's fine. But for your peace of mind and for your safety, always check those bolts. So your headset, make sure they're always good. Your stem, where your bars bolt onto, make sure that is always good. And your derailleur, make sure that's good as well. And that's pretty much it. Happy riding.